What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Nightblade tank. So the Nightblade tank is pretty much on par, if not a little bit better than the Templar tank when it comes to being a healer and a tank in the same role. So for 4-man content you might see a lot of people bring just one tank and 3 DPS. And in those instances, a Templar tank and a Nightblade tank generally have better ways to heal the group, so they're going to be stronger in those regards. However, Nightblade tanks in general are going to be considered weaker tanks compared to Dragon Knights and Wardens, mainly due to the lack of passives and a lack of group utility that they have. Nightblade tanks are going to be unique in two regards. The first one is a positive. They're the only tanks that can make use of major evasion, which increases their dodge chance by 15%. So they have a little bit of a defensive ability there. They are also unique in that they actually are the only class that doesn't, besides the Warden, that doesn't have any sort of shielding ability. So they don't have any shield ability that is a class ability. So if they are going to be using a shield, they'd be limited to using something like Annulment from the light armor skill tree, or Bone Shield from the Undaunted skill tree. And both of those skills have their own weaknesses. The Nightblade tank in general is going to be a weaker tank compared to the Dragon Knights, and the Wardens are not going to be quite as strong, and they're not going to provide quite as much group utility compared to those two classes. So you're not really going to be seeing Nightblade tanks running Vet Trials too often. Now it is possible to do so. I have seen a Nightblade tank, I believe it was SO hard mode before, but that being said, you're going to have a hard time convincing any sort of progression guild to take a Nightblade over a Dragon Knight tank, just because of that lack of group utility that the Nightblade tank provides. Yes, they have very good healing ability, they can provide a lot of heals for the group, but you know, the lack of group utility and the overall lack of a shield really hurts Nightblade when it comes to that 12-man content. So, just like our other build videos, we'll be going over our gear, going over our skills, we'll be going over our CP point distributions, we'll be talking about attributes, race, things like that, and because tanks don't really have a rotation, instead we'll be going over what you should be prioritizing, how you should be playing your tank, and kind of what you should be looking for as you are tanking content. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with our gear. So this is a very stereotypical setup for any sort of non-Dragon Knight or non-Warden tank. So we're going with Ebon and Alkosh, and we have a Monster Helm set using Swarm Mothers. So unlike Dragon Knights and Wardens, Nightblades do not have a chain ability, so they can't pull enemies towards them. So that's why we have to use Swarm Mothers here. So Swarm Mothers is only going to be useful for when you have ranged adds that have a ranged attack. So that's typically going to be things like Trash Pulls, and a couple of bosses do have adds that do range attacks that you're going to need to pull. But they're not. Swarm Mothers is not the perfect replacement for chains. Basically, if you have to taunt something that is range and is a melee ad, then you're not going to be able to chain that in using Swarm Mothers. So a classic example of this would be Zashasha, the first boss of Marvel Kaj. When they summons the cats, they are untauntable and they only have a melee attack. So you don't have a chain, so you won't be able to pull them away from your healers or DPS. So that's a really big disadvantage of using Swarm Mothers, but in most other scenarios it's going to be a fair replacement for a Dragon Knight's Unrelenting Grip or a Warden's Frozen Portal. Now, if you aren't going to be using Swarm Mothers, so for example you're up against a boss with no adds, then you're going to be using a different Monster Helm set. You're going to be using something like Bloodspawn, Lord Wardens, or Thurvokuns. Those three Monster Helm sets are the typical go-to for tanks. So Bloodspawn would be, you would use it if you want the extra ultimate generation. Lord Warden gives you the most consistent resistance buffs, and Thurvokun acts as an AoE minor maim, so it helps reduce damage in Trash Pulls. So those are the instances where you would use each of those three different Monster Helms. For our 5-piece, we're going to go with Ebon. So this is the best health set for tanks as well as just group in general, because it provides max health for everybody around you. So that's why we're using Ebon. Now, if you have two tanks in a group and one of the other tank is already wearing Ebon, the two Ebons 5 pieces don't stack on each other, so you're going to need to use a different set. So the classic set to go to would be Plague Doctor. You can use something like Green Pact or Warrior Poet if you'd like. They both have their own weaknesses. Green Pact is inferior to Plague Doctor, and Warrior Poet, the 5-piece, does not stack with Warhorn. So they kind of have their own weaknesses there. So generally speaking, Plague Doctor is going to be the best alternative instead of Ebon. Now there is also another set that you might consider using. It is a crafted set, and it is unique to the Nightblade tank, because Nightblades, like I said in the beginning of the video, do have access to major evasion, and that's going to be Tava's Favor. That's a 5-piece crafted set from Hugh's Bane, so you do need a Thieves Guild DLC in order to get to the pre-placed crafting stations, or you just need to know somebody with Tava's Favor attuned crafting stations in their house. The 5, let me see if I have any Tavas actually right now. I do. So Tava's Favor, the 2, 3, 4-piece effects, they're not terribly useful. Max health is always nice. The stamina regen doesn't really help you because when you're blocking, your stamina regen's 0, so that doesn't really help, and the magic regen is nice. And the 5-piece is when you dodge an attack, you receive the Blessing of Tava, generating 9 ultimate over 3 seconds. Now, this is a set that can uniquely be used by Nightblades because they do have the access to major evasion, which increases their dodge chance by 15%. So for every 10 attacks, you're going to dodge on average 1.5 of them. So that's really helpful for ultimate generation. So you could use this instead of Ebon if you would like, but since it is a crafted set, you're going to need to be careful if you're going to be using the other crafted set that tanks typically use, which is Torug's Pact. So more on that in just a bit here. So for our second 5-piece, we're going with Alkosh. This comes from Blockade, so you're going to need access to the Thieves Guild DLC in order to get this. So this is the most powerful debuff set in the game, because when you combine it with a Crusher enchant on top of the Alkosh proc, it reduces enemy resistances by over 5,000, so that's a pretty strong debuff. Now, if you don't have Alkosh yet, you can use some Torug's Pact, which is a 3-trait crafted set, so that basically boosts the enchant potency by, I believe it's 30%. Let me see if I have one. Yes, I do. So basically, it takes your Crusher enchant. The default is 1644. Infused would bring it up to 2108, and if you have an infused Torug's Pact Crusher, that brings it up to 2740. So Torug's Pact Crusher is going to be more consistent compared to an Alkosh debuff. Basically, you're going to have that 2740 debuff on for the entire fight, more or less, versus the Alkosh debuff where you need to activate a synergy and you can need to time it out in order to get the most out of Alkosh. So a lot of guilds are turning towards Torug's Pact instead of Alkosh because of that consistency. That being said, though, Alkosh is still going to be the stronger debuff set. Now, if you are going to be using Torug's Pact and you want to use Tava's Favor, you actually can't do that because you can't craft jewelry as of Dragon Bones. So you're going to need to basically use Ebon jewelry or Plague Doctor jewelry if you do want to use Tava's Favor, or that's basically the only way you can use Tavas. Basically, you can't use Tavas and Torug's together. You're going to need to use something like Tavas and Alkosh, or Tavas and Ebon, or Tavas and Plague Doctor, or some combination thereof. Now, there is another set that you could potentially wear in place of either of these sets, and that's going to be Akaviri Dragonguard. So Akaviri Dragonguard is a drop set from Eastmarch. It's the heavy armor set from that zone. You can see here that the 2, 3, 4-piece is all pretty helpful. Magic regen, health taken, max health. The 5-piece reduces the cost of your ultimates by 15%, so your Warhorn, which typically costs 250 ultimate, will now cost only 213 ultimate. Combine that with Nightblade's slightly increased ultimate generation. It's not quite as good as the Dragon Knight's ultimate generation, but it's still pretty good overall. For example, it's better than typically better than the Templars. It actually helps boost your Warhorn uptime, so it is a nice set to have. If the other tank is already wearing Ebon, you can do something like Dragonguard and Torug's, or Dragonguard and Alkosh, and you can go ahead and use that combination there. Now for our armor traits, so there's basically 2 different routes you can take. So the first route is going to be infused on your large pieces and sturdy on your small pieces, and that does include your shield as a large piece. The second option is going to be going all sturdy. No matter which option you decide to go with, typically speaking, you're going to be having a prismatic enchant on your large pieces for the added magic and stamina. That just helps out your resource pool. You are giving up a little bit of health, but as I'll talk about in a little bit, the max health that you really need for vet content is pretty easy to reach. You don't need to use like a max health enchant on any of your large pieces. And then for your small pieces, you're going with a max health enchant. Now for our jewelry enchants, so there is a little bit of debate here depending on who you ask, between shield play and reduced feat cost. Just from a mathematical standpoint, 3 shield play enchants will give you the largest reduction in the cost of blocking. It's not going to be quite as much as it was pre-Dragon Bones, because they did change the way that block cost was calculated, but it is still going to give you the greatest reduction. Now, there is math behind whether or not reduced feat cost is going to be better than shield plate enchants, and that's going to be dependent on how many stamina abilities you're using per second. So a lot of people are still sticking with 3 shield plate enchants because that is the best in terms of reducing your block cost. However, some people are going with this more balanced approach, which is take 1 reduced stamina cost enchant and then 2 shield plate enchants. You can play around with your enchants and see which works for your personal playstyle. I like to take this more balanced approach, which is 2 shield plate and 1 reduced stamina cost. Now for our main hand here, so we have a sword and board on our main hand and we have a lightning staff on our back bar. I only recommend using a lightning staff if you are very comfortable with the content, if you are comfortable with tanking that content. Otherwise, just stick with 2 sword and boards on your front bar as well as your back bar here. So for enchants, stick with a Crusher enchant on your front bar. You're going to want Infused on your weapon in order to increase the potency of your Crusher enchant. Doesn't matter if you have a sword or an axe or a dagger as long as it's a one-handed weapon. And for your back bar, I'm using a lightning staff here, again because I am very comfortable with tanking pretty much all the content in the game. And I have a weakening enchant here. You can double up on Crusher if you'd like in order to improve your Crusher uptime, and then just leave the weakening enchant to your healers. But that's kind of up to you and what your raid group wants. I like to take both a Crusher on front and weakening on back bar. So like I said, I only use lightning staff because I am very, very comfortable with tanking all the content. You give me Ebon and Alkosh and I can tank all the content in the game. So that's why I'm using the lightning staff here. It's also going to be infused for that increased potency on our enchants. Now, if you're not going to be using the lightning staff, you can just go with another double sword and board. Make sure your shields are both going to be infused with a prismatic enchant. It's fine if you have like one infused and one sturdy or something like that. That's perfectly fine. The difference in your resource pool shouldn't really make that big of a difference at all. So now let's talk about our secondary traits here. So in terms of race, I am an Argonian. Argonians are widely regarded to be one of the best classes for tanking. However, in my opinion, race doesn't really factor in too much for support roles, so tanks and healers, compared to DPS, because it's a lot more about how well do you know the mechanics of the fight, how well are you able to play your class, and your role as a tank. And that is not dependent on the race that you choose. Argonians are very good because they get 5% additional healing. They have a potion passive which basically restores additional resources whenever they drink any potions, so that's really, really helpful for their sustain. When they're in a pinch, they can just drink a potion and pretty much get most of their magic and stamina back. Plus they get max health and a little bit of max magicka. But there are several races that are also very good for tanking. So Imperials, if you have access to the Imperial Edition, they get 12% max health, 10% max stamina. Red Guards are not bad because they get 10% max stamina. But like I said, any race can be very successful as a tank. Wohler uses a Khajiit, I use a Dark Elf, so it doesn't really matter too much what race. It's much more important that you know the tanking mechanics and how to tank. For attribute points, this is going to be where you see the most variation between builds here. So I have 40 points into health, 14 into stamina, and 10 into magicka. So generally speaking, you're going to want to be hitting about 35k max health with Ebon. Ebon gives you the least amount of health out of all the potential health set options. So you're going to want to hit at least 35k health for endgame content, so that's vet trials. For vet dungeons, you can probably sit at 30k health with food and Ebon, and that's perfectly fine. So basically what you're going to want to do is just going to put attribute points into health until you hit about 35k, and then you can split your attribute points between magic and stamina if you'd like. The most important thing is to maintain your stamina higher than your magicka. If your stamina ends up being lower than your magicka when you pop an orb or a shard synergy, you're going to restore magicka and not stamina, and you want it to return stamina because that is what you use to block. If you run out of stamina, you can no longer block, which in that case you're probably going to be a dead tank. So depending on the race, you're going to potentially put more points into stamina compared to magicka. So for example, because I'm an Argonian and I don't get any boosts, racial passive boost to stamina, I have a little bit more points into stamina instead of magicka. Another way you can make sure that you always have higher stamina is you might want to replace a health enchant on your small piece for a stamina enchant. So just play around with your attribute distributions and your enchants until you find something that works for you. For our Mundustone, we're going with the Atranax, so this helps boost our magicka regen. All of our buffs are pretty much use magicka, so we just want to get more magicka out from our magic so we can maintain our buffs. That being said, we are using balance in order to sustain our magicka, so it's not very important that your magicka regen is super high. And then for food, we're going with Tri-Stat food, so this gives us max health, max magicka, max stamina, and this is your typical purple food, base game purple food. Now we're going over our skills, and I will mention which slots I believe are flex spots and and then I'll talk about your flexibilities and when you would use them. So starting off with our front bar, this is going to be your sword and board bar if you are using a staff or bow or dual wield back bar or something like that. Pierce Armor, Heroic Slash, these two are obviously not flex spots. Swallow Soul, this is here for the minor vitality, so you get 8% additional healing done, received I should say, as well as it acts as a kind of half decent heal over time for you, but this is a flex spot. You can swap an ability out for this spot if you would like. Balance and Absorb Magic, I don't consider these to be flex spots at all. Technically, Balance can be considered a flex spot. However, Nightblades don't really have a long duration for source of Major Resolve and Major Ward. Basically, in order to get Major Resolve and Major Ward, you need to cast a Shadow ability, and it'll give you, at this point, it'll only give you about a 12-second Major Ward and Major Resolve, which isn't very long. Compare that to Balance, which gives you 28 seconds, plus it gives you Magicka back in exchange for health. So I don't consider Balance to be a flex spot for a Nightblade tank. Some people do, and if you do consider this a flex spot, then I'll show you what you can use instead of Balance for that Major Ward and Major Resolve buff. For Ultimate, this is a flex spot as well, so there are a couple of ultimates that you can choose besides Barrier. For your backbar, so this is specific for a lightning staff backbar. If you're going with a typical swordboard backbar, then Blockade of Storms is actually a flex spot. And if you're doing like bow, this is going to be replaced with Endless Hail. If you're going dual wield, then this will be replaced with Deadly Cloak. So Inner Rage, which is your range taunt, this is not a flex spot at all. And pretty much all these spots from here on out are going to be considered flex spots for the most part. So Echoing Vigor, this is a flex spot. This is a self-heal. This is a nice hot but heal over time ability, but it does cost stamina, so you do need to be mindful of when you want to use it. You don't want to spam it because, like I said earlier, you want to conserve your stamina for blocking. Mirage, this is technically a flex spot, but I like to keep it here for the Major Evasion. It also gives you Minor Resolve and Minor Ward, which is a nice boost to your survivability. It's only a 2% damage mitigation if you're not already at the resistance cap, but every little bit helps out for your survivability. So I don't consider this a flex spot, but some people do. Blockade of Storms, this is not a flex spot if you're using a lightning staff, but if you're not, then this is a flex spot. So like I mentioned, if you're using a bow, you're going to be using Endless Hail. If you're using dual wield, you'll be using Deadly Cloak. If you're using a sword and board though, then you can replace this spot with any of the other flexibilities that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Then Leeching Strikes, this is also, I consider this to be a flex spot. A lot of Nightblade tanks don't consider this to be a flex spot because this is a very good source of additional stamina regen. Basically, whenever you do a light or heavy attack, you heal, and you get a little bit of stamina back, and when you let it completely run out, you restore up to 4.3k stamina. So a lot of people don't consider this a flex spot because you do want to have that additional stamina. So I very, very hesitantly call it a flex spot because you might not necessarily need Leeching Strikes in all scenarios, but for the most part, you do want to keep this on your bar if you can help it. And then Aggressive Horn, this is a must-have for all support roles, healers, and tanks. Now for our flex spot options here. So Refreshing Path is one potential ability that you might want to use, especially if you don't want to use Balance, because this is the only way that you're going to be able to proc Major Resolve and Major Wars. You can see here that it will proc for an initial 6 seconds, and then it gives you a 125% boost to the duration because we have 5 heavy armor pieces. So that actually boosts it to around 12 seconds or so. So that's basically the duration of Refreshing Path, more or less. So basically, if you cast Refreshing Path on cooldown, then you'll always have Major Ward or Major Resolve. So that's something to keep in mind. It does have a small heal over time component behind it, so that's really nice to have. Plus, it gives you Major Expedition, which might come in handy in some cases. Not all fights, but it is a nice bonus to have just in case. Under Siphoning Attacks, Sap Essence is one potential option here. This is mainly for Trash Bowls, and it's going to be for that burst heal that you see there. So it basically heals for, in this case, 1.1k, plus 20% more for each enemy hit. So if you're in a giant Trash Bowl and you use Sap Essence, that's a pretty good burst heal, but it's not going to be useful for boss fights, obviously, because that's a very small heal overall. So this is going to be more for Trash Pulls compared to everything else. So there's nothing really here too much to talk about. So under the fighter skill, you have Circle of Protection. You can go with either morph, so Turn Undead or Ring of Preservation. You're only going to be using this during execute phases on some fights. A good example would be Ethereal Archive against a mage during that last bit of health there. When you're all stacked up against her and you're constantly receiving damage, you drop down Circle of Protection, which gives you and 5 other people minor protection, which reduces the damage that they take. So that's going to be very useful for those kind of scenarios. If you're going into TB, progressing through Veteran Halls Fabrication, this is a must-have. This is the classic skill that you're going to be using during the execute for Assembly General. Sanguine Altar is another ability that you might want to have. This is mainly here for the minor lifesteal. So basically it applies minor lifesteal to every enemy within the radius, which is 28 meters. It's a very large radius, so that just helps out with the heal over time. Plus the synergy is a percentage heal, so it's very useful no matter which role you are. And your allies can actually activate this twice during the duration of Sanguine Altar, because it does last 46 seconds, and its cooldown for synergies is actually 20 seconds. So that's why I prefer Sanguine over Overflowing, even though Overflowing, the synergy heals for more. Rapids, this is mainly here if you're doing speed runs, score runs, just to reduce the time. We already talked about Vigor. This is a flex spot for the self-heal. Efficient Purge. If you're going to be in a fight where you need to purge debuffs, a good example would be the first boss of Halls of Fabrication. You need to purge the poison dot. In that case, you would be running Efficient Purge. It'll basically remove it from you and 5 other people around you. So that's when you would use Purge. Don't use Cleanse. Cleanse is very expensive. As you can see here, it's almost 8,000 magicka more, or 3,000 magicka more. So just stick with Efficient. And then the final flex spot that we can talk about is going to be Stalwart Guard. This is going to be very advanced endgame guilds, so Mechanically Challenged, Some Eternal Way, Blind Luck. They have their support roles run Stalwart Guard. They basically guard a ranged DPS, giving them minor force, which basically increases their critical damage, so it increases their DPS. You're also increasing their survivability because you're taking some damage away from them. So basically, whatever damage they would take 30% of that. Attach your mitigation on top of that damage, and that's how much damage you would take. So it's not a flat 30%, it's going to be additionally mitigated by your own mitigation. So you will need to double bar Stalwart Guard if you are going to end up using this ability. Now in terms of the flex ultimate, you can use Barrier if you would like, but there is another ultimate that you might be using depending on your specific guild and your specific strategy for the fight. That's going to be Bolstering Darkness, and this basically gives you and your allies major protection, which reduces the damage taken by 30%. This is a 5-meter radius, so it's about the size of Circle of Protection. It also reduces your damage by additional 30%. There's also an additional synergy associated with this, which gives them a nice heal over time effect, so that's always nice to have. So much like Circle of Protection, this is going to be mainly be used in execute phases, where you're going to need to reduce the damage taken during execute. Classic example would be Halls of Fabrication, the final boss, the Assembly General. During the execute phase, if you do have a Nightblade tank or a Nightblade DPS, they might be asked to run Bolstering Darkness in order to get that additional major protection during that execute phase. One other potential ultimate that you might want to use is going to be Soul Siphon, and that's just for the additional heal over time. It's not going to be used very often. In fact, I don't really see Nightblade tanks use it at all, but it is an option if you do want to give your allies a nice heal over time, as well as an additional source of a synergy. It's not a very strong synergy, but it's there just in case you want it. Now let's go over our champion points. So the CP cap is 720, which gives us 240 points to put across each of the different constellations. So starting off with our green CPs, we have 64 into Arcanus and 64 into Tenacity, and we could push it up to 75 if you'd like, but that would give you fewer CP points to put across Shadow Ward and Tumbling and Warlord to reduce your stamina cost. So I personally just keep it at 64, but you can push it up to 75 if you would like. I have 56 in the Shadow Ward to help reduce the cost of blocking, and then I have 20 into Tumbling and 20 into Warlord to help reduce stamina cost from Break Free and dodge rolling. Now for our blue CPs, so this is going to be a pure tank character, so you're not going to be doing DPS or anything like that. This is the CP point distribution you would go with, so 100 Blessed, 100 Elfborn, and 40 Precise Strikes. A lot of the nodes here are focused around DPS kind of boosts, so it's not really going to be helpful all too much to you as a tank, because you're obviously not going to be doing that much damage. So you just want to have additional healing done. You won't be critting that much with your magic or stamina heals, but it's nice to have that additional heal ability when you do happen to have a crit there. If this tune does double as a DPS, in that case just go with your typical DPS spec for CP points. And finally, for our red CPs, I like to take a one-size-fits-most approach. So basically, the distribution that I have is not optimal for every single trial, but it is good enough to get you by all the trials. So that's what I have to call a balanced approach. Now, depending on the trial and how survivable you feel you are, you might want to swap around your CPs. So a good example would be Hellra Citadel. You might be taking more physical damage on Hellra and not a lot of elemental damage. So you might want to take points at Elemental Defender and put them into Hardy, Ironclad, things like that in order to help your survivability, especially against, you know, the warrior, for example, in Hellra. You definitely want to put a lot of points into Hardy and Ironclad if this is your first time or second time tanking the warrior. So I have 61 into Ironclad, 51 into Thick Skin, 64 into Hardy, and Elemental Defender. Now we do want to mention Bastion and Quick Recovery here. You can put 11 points or 31 points into Bastion or Quick Recovery for the Field Physician and Infusion passives if you would like. As a tank, you won't really be resurrecting somebody, so you won't be able to make very good use of these passives. So a lot of tanks actually don't put any points into this tree at all. But it is nice to have, because sometimes if you're an off tank, you might be resurrecting somebody, and being able to give them a little bit more magic or regen, or, you know, reducing the damage you take while you're resurrecting somebody can be nice to have. But you're not really going to be using it all too often, so I personally don't recommend putting any points into this tree here. So now with all the build stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about how you play your Nightblade tank here. So Nightblade tanks kind of play very similarly when it comes to Dragon Knights in some regard, but also very differently, because if you are going to be using siphoning attacks, you're just going to be really focused on light weaving. So you're going to be light weaving very much as a Nightblade tank in order to take advantage of siphoning attacks for that heal as well as the stamina regen. So a Nightblade tank has a little bit of a steeper learning curve compared to Dragon Knights and Warden tanks, because you will need to learn the mechanics of the fight. You are going to need to know when it's opportune to use your light attacks and light weave your abilities compared to just blocking. You know, so in that regard, Nightblade tanks are a little bit harder to learn if you intend on using siphoning attacks for that additional stamina return there. So in terms of buffs, obviously you're going to want to make sure you always have your major ward and major resolve. So if you're using balance, that's going to come from that. Otherwise, you're going to be using Refreshing Path in order to continually have your major ward and major resolve. So you're just going to be using that on cooldown. If you're using Mirage, obviously you're going to want to keep that up. That lasts for 26 seconds, I believe. So you don't have to cast it very often, but just make sure to recast it whenever you have the chance to do so. Now obviously you're going to want to keep your taunt up, so that's Pierce Armor or Inner Light. Pierce Armor obviously is the preferred method because it gives major fracture and major breach on the enemy, which helps boost your DPS. The other ability that you're always going to want to have on the boss is going to be Heroic Slash, and that's going to be mainly for the minor heroism buff, so you get a little bit more ultimate generation, as well as the minor maim, which decreases the damage done by the boss by 15%, so it helps reduce the damage incoming to your DPS, so that's really nice to have as well. Other than that, the Nightblade tank really doesn't have that many buffs and not many abilities that you're going to need to recast on a very constant basis, unlike the Dragon Knight, for example. You know, you don't have something like Igneous Shield, which you're going to be casting every 6 seconds or so. So one thing that I do want to take note of is if you are going to be using Swallow Soul, it's going to be beneficial to cast it every 4 seconds in order to get the additional ultimate gain. So under Siphoning and Transfer, you can get 2 ultimate every 4 seconds when you cast the Siphoning ability. You're not going to want to do it with Leeching Strikes because you won't be able to get the max amount of stamina returned, because if you re-up it early. So you're going to want to use Swallow Soul instead if you're going to be using that. That also helps maintain a nice heal over time on you. It's going to be, if you look at this, it's going to be 30% of about 3.5k, so you're looking at roughly a 1k heal every 2 seconds for 10 seconds. So it's a very small heal over time, but it is beneficial. It's pretty much a little bit weaker. It's about half as potent as Resolving Vigor or Echoing Vigor. So it's not a very strong heal over time. So you're mainly going to be doing this more for the ultimate generation, more so than the heal over time effect. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found this informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.